Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're just a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanella, and today I'm joined by Pastor Kellen from Tumwater UMC. How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's a little dreary out, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that it's finally fall in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, it was really hanging on to summer for like the last month or so.
Truly, truly.
So I guess we should say the film that we're going to discuss today is Lion. Had you seen the film before?
Yeah, actually, back in 2019, so this is a 2016 film,
Mm-hmm.
but back in 2019, I applied and started seminary, which is a graduate program that all clergy people, pastors, people who want to go into ministry need to do in order to be ordained. It's a 3-year program. So I moved to Boston, and actually before we even started our program, we were asked to watch this movie before coming into our orientation together. And the idea around that whole piece there was we were focusing on the themes of dwelling and seeking, two movements, spiritual movements that you see happening a lot in the movie. And so the idea of where do we find home, especially for people who are moving to a new place to start a new program, and then where do you seek out? Because it's important to have both, you know? So, of course, the tears came the first time, and the second time I watched that movie as I started seminary. But this is, it was my third time watching it in preparation. Have you had an experience with the film before us getting ready for this?
Yeah, so I think this is the first time I had watched it all the way through. I know my family had maybe rented it like on Netflix back when we were still getting like CDs, DVDs
Yeah.
in the mail. And I think this was one of the movies we had. And I wasn't really interested in it. It was the kind of thing where it's like I was doing math homework or something. And it was just playing on the TV and my mom was crying in the corner. And so I wasn't really invested in it.
Yeah.
But this go round, I really did get very connected to the characters, and I thought it was great. And I was almost like kicking myself for not enjoying it when I first saw it quite a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that happens with these kind of cinematic ambiance focused movies. Like there's so many shots in this movie that are just like a violin and like a panning shot. And so if you weren't paying close attention, you might be like, oh, this is just some soapy movie.
Right.
When you get invested, it's a real emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, I mean, something that like clicked together, this is the second time I watched it, was the opening sequence has a lot of just shots of the landscape with, like you were saying, the violin and the orchestra music. And it takes a while for the plot to actually get going, because there's at least a couple minutes of just this intro of just the landscape.
Yeah.
And you're not really connected to the characters or anything. But it comes back in one of the climaxes of the film. It's like the landscape is being caught in like memories and glimpses. And so when the footage is brought back and juxtaposed with the Google Earth images, because we were watching the intro, we are familiar with the landscape, not as intimately as the characters are, but at least a little bit, enough to realize what the filmmakers are trying to connect.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to get too far into it before we kind of introduce why we're watching this film. But yeah, like as memory becomes and looking to the past becomes like a motif of the movie, where we're really drawn to the landscape of the land and the contrast between the two landscapes that become the primary settings for the movie. But we might be getting too into the weeds before.
I mean, we could just hop right into it. Why was this film chosen?
Yeah. So a part of what we do, and this is just me being honest on behalf of the co-op pastors who help to plan all of this, is really try to crowdsource movies. This is the third year of Anti-Racist Film Club's existence. And so because we watch these films together, we have to make sure that we have the license to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we'll be, talking about what's coming next, and we'll talk about these movies we're really passionate about, and we'll look up the distribution licenses, and wah wah, we can't
Ah.
watch it. And so sometimes we'll just get in these conversations, and a lot of times we really want to focus our movies on the American experience because it really helps us ground us in our anti-racist work as both people working on our own racism and people trying to walk in Christian faith
Mm-hmm.
for justice. But sometimes we need to go beyond that. And really, Lion, although set in Australia and India, shares a lot of the same motifs of identity, of cultural assimilation and loss, and also just like struggle of the experience of people of color that have come or been taken out of their home settings
Mm-hmm.
and then forced to live in a white dominant culture. And so Lion just felt like a good fit, and we had the rights to show it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to read a little description of what this film is if you listeners at home haven't seen it yet. This is a good place to pause the podcast, watch the film, or just enjoy the spoilers that come after this moment. Lion is a 2016 film based on the book A Long Way Home by Saru Brewerly about the true story of reconnecting with his birth family after 25 years of separation. Starring major Hollywood stars like Dev Patel, Nicole Kidman, and Rooney Mara, Lion was nominated for 6 Oscars and won 2 BAFTAs, one for Patel's role as Best Supporting Actor and the other for Best Adapted Screenplay. It is currently the 5th highest grossing Australian film of all time. Growing up in impoverished India, 5-year-old Saru is separated from his brother at the train station and is accidentally trapped on a 2-day journey away from home. Lost in Calcutta and unable to speak the local language Bengali, Saru is eventually brought to an orphanage where he's then adopted by the Brewerly family in Tasmania. 25 years later, adult Saru, now a hotel management student in Melbourne, begins searching for his hometown in India. Using Google Earth to cross-match thousands of train stations with his own memory, Saru loses touch with his girlfriend, adoptive family, and all life outside of his obsessive search. Will Saru find his birth family? Will he lose a life he's made in the meantime? Lion is the journey of one man on the impossible quest to find his way home.
Yeah, and it has you at the edge of your seat the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that as we start to dig into and unpack, now that we can get into the story of things, it feels natural to start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And before I do this, I just have to name the experience of Saru, and it's important as we're on this journey. When we watch any of these movies that depict an amazing story, an amazing circumstance, we have to realize that this is just one instance of a young boy in India.
Right.
And this is not an experience that every boy in India has. And so yeah, we see Saru looking up to his brother. He lives in a small community, and he goes out with his brother, ends up stealing coal from train stations in order to sell the coal at a market for food for his family. And so even at like the age of 5, Saru is trying to provide for his family.
Mm-hmm.
And the real crux of that beginning, where he becomes lost, comes when he tries to overextend himself to go to the train station and work the night with his brother. And that's when he loses his brother, and he jumps on the train looking for him, and after 2 days ends up in Kolkata.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think about this isn't the case for all people, but just like the traumas of our past that affect so much into the future. So he spends months living in this place that speaks a different dialect from where he grew up. They were speaking Hindi, and now he's speaking Bengali. There's that moment where he's just running around all day trying to get his way back home, and then at the end of the day he feels like he has this moment of safety and lays down with the other kids there, and then is woken up in the middle of the night by kidnappers who are trying to take these children into trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
So like trauma after trauma, and then his experience later with Noor and
Rama,
her partner, who groom him for being sold into trafficking again.
Potentially, it's
Potentially,
ambiguous what their intentions were,
right?
because we're seeing the interaction through the eyes of Saru.
Yes.
It's a true story that like this is inspired by a real event. He doesn't know what they were planning, but he's said in interviews that he just had a gut feeling that it was bad and that he needed to get out of there.
Yeah, and thanks for checking me on that, because that's just the story as it goes. And so it's really interesting the way that that all leads to his experience ending up in the orphanage.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe this will be a good entry point into one of these topics that I think will bridge across the Indian and Australian experience into the American experience, which is the adoption systems of the world. Saru ends up in the orphanage, and I think one of the interesting pieces is you see him in the presence of so many other Indian children, and then pretty quickly he's like selected to be adopted by this Australian family.
Right.
It like begs the question of like, our adoption systems around the world, or at least how they were. This is set in the 80s. I know that they've changed since then. There's a lot less international adoption happening nowadays, but you're left wondering what made Saru adoptable, you know? Was he young enough, or was he cute enough? I don't know. I was left with that question at that point in the movie, thinking about our adoption system.
Mm-hmm. One of the interviews I was watching was with Saru Brearley and his mother, Sue. And she was talking about the adoption process of getting both Saru and then his adopted brother, Mantosh. Mantosh's adoption was much more logistically difficult. It took longer. I think it was a process that took years, whereas Saru's was much quicker.
Yeah.
And I don't know which in the movie Saru's is initiated first, but from the interview it sounded like it might have been the other way around. But I don't know. It was a very they didn't go into much detail about that part of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does seem interesting because Mantosh in the film is the one who's less adjusted throughout his entire life and has to deal with some of the trauma that he experienced, probably from living on the streets or even living in the orphanage, which itself was not a hospitable environment.
Yeah.
It might have been better than living on the street, but it was still sort of run like a prison or a juvenile detention center.
And the filmmakers want you to think that, you know, the imagery you walk by and you follow Saru in it, and there's the kids up against the fence that are, you get that motif of you're now incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people who watch films are going to see that and think about any film that they've seen where someone becomes incarcerated and they're walking to be to the intake section of the jail, and they see all the people banging against the rails, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does begin to, you know, play on that, and we have such a history of that before the United States went to the foster care system, which still has its flaws in it. Our orphanage systems were built the exact same way, and often especially the history with the native populations in the United States of education schools where they would strip their cultural identity, where they would teach them how to assimilate to culture. So I'm thinking of Saru's experience learning how to not eat with his hands, which was the cultural norm, and to use cutlery so he would be prepared when he went to Australia.
I mean, to the point where later on in the film, as he's an adult and he's eating at some friend's house, and they happen to also be Indian,
right,
and they're eating an Indian meal, he's corrected and saying like, "Oh no, you're supposed to use your hands. Like you don't use a fork or whatever he was attempting to use." And you see that a few different times of the ways that he's so adjusted to the Western customs and etiquette.
Yeah.
And then also his loss of language as well.
Yeah.
We brought it up a little bit earlier in the discussion, but language is such an interesting motif in the film, especially like the miscommunication, the way that interferes with these infrastructures and systems. From Saru trying to walk around Calcutta and no one understanding what he's saying because he's literally speaking a different language. Or when he's first on the train, I didn't really understand why people were just looking at him as he's going past and yelling for help and no one's having a reaction. They probably didn't understand what he was saying at all.
Yeah. I mean, and that's part of the interesting piece, like, and we might not experience that as much in the American landscape, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that immigrants in the American landscape experience that all the time,
Right.
especially children of immigrants. And we hear about that, like, just in the news in the past few years, like children being separated from their parents at detention centers on the southern border of the United States. Like, this is not just something that happens in India,
Right.
And so children being separated from their parents for various reasons and then not having the systems in place to actually reunite them. And so talk about failed systems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that the film claims that Saru didn't reconnect with his mother is that she couldn't read or write. So even if
Mm-hmm.
she saw the ads that he was missing, which she probably didn't because it was thousands of kilometers away,
Mm-hmm.
she might have like recognized the picture maybe, but it like all the information would have been useless unless there was someone in the community who could translate.
Yeah. And I think as Christians, when we think about the adoption system, we have a lot of history to reckon with. Maybe not like as much. We at the co op are find ourselves Methodists. I shouldn't say we have a lot to reckon with as Methodists in our history with adoption, in our
Mm-hmm.
history with re-education programs,
Yes.
even in Washington State, like over the Yakama Nation, like atrocities committed there for towards children of the Yakama Nation.
Mm-hmm.
But coming out of evangelical circles as well, adoption at the time that the movie was set was really pushed, and not just in adoption locally, but more saving children from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get a real white savior complex going on with parents. And I think that we see that happening with Sue and John later in the film. You see it at each step, but uh, when Saru is having his identity crisis starting to spiral, searching for home, he tries to save face, right? Save face with his mother, not tell his mother that he's looking for his biological mother.
Right.
In this conversation between Sue and Saru, she says, it comes to light that she wasn't infertile and she
Which
wanted,
is what he assumed
yes,
most of his life, is that the only reason that he had been adopted was because his parents couldn't have their own children.
right. And it kind of comes to light that she said, I just wanted to make a better life for you all. To like recognize the spectrum of complexity that there is around adoption and racism or like white savior attitude in our system. Like, yes, Saru was in a really tough place, and his life probably wouldn't have been had been the way that it turned out to be if he hadn't had been adopted. And this is the story for so many people. But it's easy, I think, for us to hold on to one case. Like, I can look at this adopted child and then think of an entire culture or an entire people group, like in that same way.
Mm-hmm.
If Saru had this experience and he came to a first world, I'm doing air quotes here through the airwaves, nation, and assimilated and had all this opportunity to go to college and everything and have this life where he could surf and enjoy wine and all this kind of stuff, then all Indians, like, not experiencing the breadth of what you could experience if you were in Australia.
Right.
I feel like it's easy for us to get in that trap.
I think one of the things I appreciated about this film is that it had a fairly nuanced take on this, where it wasn't condemning the Brearley family
Mm-hmm.
for taking Saru away from India and making it much, much harder for him to eventually make his way back to the village where he was really from. It's not condemning them. It's not really condemning anything other than the brutality of the system that he was in the orphanage and on the streets, and like the true atrocities of like human trafficking
Right.
that the film is very much against. But in terms of the two lives that he had, the film never argues that one was better than the other. They both just were the realities of the situation.
Yes.
And the reason he doesn't tell his parents isn't because he's ashamed to be looking at the past, or that he doesn't think that they would necessarily support him, but because it was a very difficult difficult decision. He wanted to make sure that he could do it before filling them in on what he was doing.
Yeah.
A lot of it has the mentality of like, what happens. It's not for better or for worse or meant to be. It's just the reality of life, and it's not necessarily better or worse.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point now that I'm thinking about the reunion scene towards the end of the film.
Mm-hmm.
You never get a sense that it's like, oh, this dirty village, or poor mother or sister that he reunites with. It's actually it's beautiful in its own right. It's different, and it's beautiful and colorful and loving.
Mm-hmm.
The people that surround the community, the like love that's there, or like the even like the strangers that he's like, he shows a picture and he says his name, and then the man takes him to his mother, and that's just different than his experience was either in Tasmania or in Melbourne.
Right.
And you're right, the film isn't condemning or saying of either, but we see Saru really wrestle with that, and I feel like that kind of takes us into a conversation of identity. Like,
mm-hmm. I think the closest the film does get to like, or to showing the way that he's wrestling with this aspect of the transformation of his life is when someone asks what did his mother do, and he says that she couldn't read, and it was like, oh, like what was her job, and it's like, oh, she carried rocks.
mm-hmm.
And then the reaction from the people is like that was her job.
Yeah.
And you see him sort of having to like justify that or explain that to himself, and to appreciate like why, like, my life is extremely different than what it would have been.
Yeah.
But then the film doesn't go further to say like, and that's why it's so much better that I go to college and all of these things.
Yeah, well, and it does show us like the internalized biases that folks who live and grow, and this is where we can think about racism affecting all people. This isn't just a white person problem or an Indian person problem or an Australian problem. Like, this is an everybody a problem, because in that setting at that party that we've mentioned, it was people from all types of cultures that had come together and met at college, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them Indian, some other, but all of them recoiled when he said that. And that was like, we are brought under this guise of thinking that if you are a laborer, your life must be awful. Yeah, and it creates that kind of reaction that we saw. And then the guilt of, like, the survivor's guilt of Saru.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in this scenario anymore.
Well, I mean, at that same party, there's another moment. What triggers his desire to really start looking? Because it's clearly been on his mind for years, but like, what really is the catalyst for his search is when he sees the jalebi,
Mm-hmm.
which was a delicacy that he had always talked with his brother. Like, one day we're going to make so much money that we can buy this food. And then the next time he encounters it, it's just sitting on a plate en masse in his friend's house.
Yeah. And so he gets this moment, it's almost like when we repress our traumas from our childhood. Mm-hmm. And he has this triggering moment where he realizes, like, this was what I wanted. This was the highest thing that I wanted, and my life is such a different perspective now. And he's grappling with that. And I think the movie does a good way. Like, they get together in the afternoon, and you know that it's bright out, and then it cuts later when they're kind of wrestling with the realization that Saru had just had about, he says, I'm not from Calcutta. And he starts, that's like the beginning of him starting to question his identity, mm-hmm. which I feel like it's a real complicated thing to ask. Like, when I think about my identity here in the United States, I am a white person, but my cultural identity is actually pretty weak because of this norm and this white supremacist culture that forced this melting pot attitude.
Right.
So because of the color of my skin, my grandparents and their grandparents, because we've been in the United States for a long time, they gave up their cultural identity in order to fit into this normalized white Anglo-Saxon Protestant capitalist identity. And so we're left with kind of a lack of identity as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what was interesting to me personally about this film, just because of my own academic experience, is that I took a class one time on new immigration cinema. No, sorry, it's immigration cinema in New Europe. And Australia is not Europe, but for the purposes of like Western media, it's
Mhm.
very similar.
Right.
And a huge running theme in that class was looking at first generation immigration cinema and then second generation immigration cinema. And second generation immigration cinema had a huge running theme of an intergenerational divide, where the children of immigrants wanted to assimilate more, and the first generation was hanging on to the culture because they didn't want to lose it. Right. And so that's where you get a lot of communities in England, or in what was another? A lot of movies took place in Italy that we watched, and Sweden, I think, was another big one. But anyway, that was interesting for this film because Saru didn't have that. He was by nature assimilated just by the family that he was adopted by. He
Right.
didn't have the community that wanted to hang on to the cultural identity.
Mhm.
So he didn't really have a reason to do that. It wasn't helpful in any way, at least when he was 5 years old.
Mhm.
It, like, he didn't need to cook recipes that he remembered, or eat with his hands, or even hang on to Hindi, his native language,
Yes.
to the point where when he does make his way home and meet his mother again, he needs a translator.
Right. Yeah. It's so real. And like, I think that Saru is, for us, the viewer, an example of both the positive and the negative, like the personal positive and the negative of successful cultural assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you lose your language, you lose cultural practices and norms, whether it's eating or whether it's relating to other people. But he also had a very smooth life in Australia. By all means, Saru is Australian by the time he's an adult, before he's Indian, right?
Right. And I mean, he even has a line where he's with the college group,
Mhm.
and they're asking everyone where they're from. And he says that he was adopted from Calcutta. And then he says that, like, oh, and then people are trying to relate to him and saying, like, oh, I have family in Calcutta, or
Yes.
various other areas. And then he kind of shuts it down by saying, like, oh, I'm not. I think he says, like, I'm not really Indian,
Mhm.
because he just very much identifies as Australian. Like, even when that part of the conversation is introduced, someone asks him, like, oh, born and raised in, I think he's from Hobart, Tasmania.
Mhm.
And he had to think about it for a second, because it read to me like he was just nodding along, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna agree with what you're saying, because yeah, I'm Australian. And then he decides to sort of get into the conversation of, actually, I'm not.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And we see the exact same thing happen in that conversation when they're like, oh, so you must like cricket, a huge sport for
Oh, that was
both
such an awkward
countries.
conversation.
Yeah, and he's like, but do you root for the Indians or do you root for the Australians? And he says, oh, always Australians. And the Indian guy who's striking him up is like, oh, yeah, it's that interesting, like, when people try to make connections, but you have assimilated, you might lose that cultural connection piece,
Mm-hmm.
And another piece of that, another dimension, I think, is the contrast between Saru and Mantosh.
Yes.
How we see Mantosh come. The film isn't really clear if it's a developmental disability or just like an impulse control thing with his self-harm.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell that the film wants us to at least infer that his assimilation was not as complete, or I should say smooth, as Saru's was, because we
Right.
see him like at the beginning of the transition, the 25-year later mark, and he forgets to show up to meals, and he's struggling. I think you're supposed to infer that he's struggling with alcoholism and can't keep a job because he asks for Saru to give him one once he comes back as a hotel manager.
Mm-hmm.
It's that piece of like, it's not always going to go well when you rip someone from their home.
Right. And even Saru has a line to his mother in the film, and he apologizes for not being a blank slate, both he and Mantosh,
Mm-hmm.
making the point that, like, Mantosh's more or a less smooth assimilation is more visible than Saru's, but it's not a complete one, and they both had baggage.
Yeah.
And yeah, it feeds into what I'm saying about this film being nuanced in more than one way and having that dimension that you mentioned. It's not like hailing anyone as a hero. Um, it's just depicting the reality of the situation.
Yeah. And I think that that's probably the biggest learning when we think about our anti-racist work, when we watch this film and then try to dig deeply about it, is that we have to get away from a binary
Mm-hmm.
in all aspects of understanding our anti-racism, whether this is in cultural assimilation or in the adoption process or even in the like finding of identity. We can't look at adoption and say cross-cultural adoption is always evil because we know that that's not true.
No, yeah, absolutely not.
People are given opportunities when a system fails them in one place to be loved and cared for by another family and find identity in that. But then on the other side of things, like there is baked into the history and the current status of cross-cultural adoption that leads to, or that is based in like a white supremacist, white savior culture. And so it's a both and of parents working on their own work, maybe if they come from a dominant culture,
Mm-hmm.
and children working on finding identity. It's imperative that whether this is like a real part of our lives, like we have adopted cross-culturally, or on our own journeys with thinking about how we interact with cultures or think about other places around the planet, that it's not just a binary, it's not good, bad, that it's this journey of complicated stuff.
Exactly.
In a similar vein with like culturally assimilating, we have the positives of like being a part of the community that you live in and belong to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of where you came from, there is a cultural communicate. Like Saru is able to, he connects with people because he is Australian and he lives in Australia. Whereas he begins to see the other side of that eventually. That flip side of it is when he begins to feel that guilt of losing his culture and not feeling like he has a home. I remember when him and his girlfriend Lucy, thank you, are kind of in the climax of their arguments. He really has difficulty. He's got guilt. He says, like, I live in all of this privilege. We live in all of this privilege while, like, I don't know what's happening to my family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that, like, even joining into a culture or learning and growing up in a certain way when you've been taken from that, that's got positives and negatives, and it's just part of the journey to like name that, understand that, and then have grace for the people who are working through it, or the ways that we're working through it.
Yeah. So as people are watching Lion, maybe for the first time, maybe for the second time, maybe you paused the podcast earlier when we told you to, and you're going to go back and rewatch it later. What questions, Pastor Kellen, do you want people to be thinking about as they're consuming this film?
Yeah, I'd like you to ask yourself, like, regardless of the makeup of your family, like, what does family mean to you? I think that family, and I think more broadly, like identity with the people around you, is like a huge theme here in Lion. And so what does identity say? And like along the lines of whether you come from culturally dominant identity here in the United States, white identity, or a different background, like how does that play in, or how does the lack of your identity around your race play in, and how do you see that playing in the story of Saru? Another question that I think folks could be pondering as they're watching or thinking or preparing for a conversation with others is like, I mean, this similarly stems off from the last one. Like, how does our identity play into our sense of like welcome and home
Mm-hmm.
in our communities. Like when we're thinking as anti-racists or like members of religious communities, like how does the way that we behave as a community, or how does our belonging as members of that community welcome or exclude others? I know that in church conversations there's this big question: is there such thing as a multicultural church or a multi-ethnic church?
Mm-hmm.
The jury is out. Scholars, theologians, sociologists are not in agreement about whether or not we actually can, because mainly of the dominant identity of white supremacy, of just like white culture and how it plays in many of our churches. However, there are exceptions. And so I guess when we think about our communities, whether that's a church community or just like a book group or our anti-racist film club, how do our identities, whether it's racial or religious or cultural, affect our sense of belonging in our groups? I think more specifically, and a third thing to be pondering before we get together for our meeting is how do we navigate wanting to help people like Sue and John do? How do we navigate wanting to help people and serve and perhaps even like adopt alongside the reality of the white savior complex of thinking of the narrative that many of us have been told, that the United States or other similarly developed countries are just the way to be.
Sure.
How do we fight against that narrative? You know, how do we fight against that narrative that that's not the case, that the narrative in Lion that actually helps us work with and then bring that into our lives?
Yeah, those are heavy things to think about.
Sorry, yeah, just some giant questions. Sorry for waxing poetic.
Yeah, I mean, you got a week to grapple with the existential stuff.
Well, I really look forward to our conversation and digging deeply. Lauren, I've enjoyed riffing with you for these last few minutes, and I just can't wait to dig deeply with the rest of the crew.
Yeah, it should be a very interesting discussion.
Well, thanks for hosting us here, and I hope that this was helpful for folks, whether you showed up to the actual conversation or you're listening to this weeks after the fact.
All right, well, I'm going to read my quick little outro script, and yeah. Thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen Lion, it's available to rent on Amazon Prime and Apple TV. As far as I know, you can't stream the film on any major service in the United States, but VPNs are also a thing, and so are libraries. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, visit funqually.org or follow the links in your description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify or Anchor, so that you don't miss our next upload. But before we sign off, I just want to thank you, Pastor Kellen, for leading our conversation today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
It's been really interesting. I enjoyed this film. I think I might enjoy it even more if I watched it again.
Yeah, it's got layers. It's like an onion.
Yes. But that is pretty much everything that we have on the docket today. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, bye now.